Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The frost had come early to Crimson Vale that autumn morning, coating the packed dirt of the central clearing in a thin, glittering layer of ice that crunched beneath the feet of 47 unmated Omegas, who stood in a single, humiliating line, like livestock waiting to be inspected, purchased, or worse, passed over entirely. Seraphina Ashwood stood at the very end of that line, positioned there deliberately by Pack Alpha Marcus Redstone, who had learned over the years that hiding her was easier than explaining her, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching the way her breath created small clouds of mist in the frigid air, counting each exhale as a way to keep herself from thinking too hard about what was about to happen. This was her 7th choosing ceremony in 6 years, and if there was one thing Sarah had learned from the previous 6, it was that hope was a dangerous thing for someone like her, for someone whose long silver hair caught the early morning light and seemed to glow like liquid moonlight, whose skin was so pale it was almost translucent with a faint shimmer that made people whisper about curses and unnatural births, whose violet-gray eyes were the color of storm clouds at twilight and saw far too much of what people desperately wanted to keep hidden. She could hear the other Omegas preening and positioning themselves, their excited whispers carrying on the cold air as they anticipated the arrival of the Alphas and Betas from neighboring packs, all of them hoping to be chosen, to escape the monotony of pack life and perhaps find a mate who would value them, cherish them, give them the home and family that every Omega instinctively craved. Sarah had once felt that same desperate hope, back during her first choosing ceremony at 18, when she had still believed that someone might look past her unusual appearance and see the person underneath. The healer who could walk through dreams and ease the nightmares that plagued traumatized wolves. The gentle soul who spent her free time comforting the pups in the Undesirable house, where she had been raised since infancy. The young woman who wanted nothing more than to belong somewhere, to someone, to matter in a world that had made it abundantly clear she was an inconvenience at best, and a curse at worst. That hope had died slowly, painfully, one rejection at a time. And now all that remained was a hollow resignation that settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and permanent. The Undesirable house was exactly what it sounded like, a ramshackle building on the far edge of pack territory where Crimson Vale kept the orphans, the deformed, the mentally unstable, anyone who didn't fit the perfect image of what a pack wolf should be. And Sarah had lived there for all 24 years of her life, ever since someone had left her as an infant at the pack border, wrapped in silver silk that had long since been sold for supplies, with no note, no explanation, no hint of who her parents were or why they had abandoned her. The pack had taken her in because Moon Goddess law demanded it, because leaving an infant to die was a sin no pack could commit without facing divine retribution. But they had never let her forget that she was charity, unwanted, a burden they bore out of obligation rather than love. Her gift had manifested when she was 12, the ability to walk through dreams, to enter the sleeping minds of others and see their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets, their hidden traumas that festered like wounds beneath the surface of their waking lives. And at first, the pack elders had been excited, thinking perhaps this strange, silver-haired child might have some use after all. They had brought her wolves suffering from nightmares, from grief, from psychological wounds that traditional healing could not touch, and Sarah had helped them all, walking through their dreams with the gentle compassion that came as naturally to her as breathing, soothing their terrors, helping them process their pain, giving them the peace they so desperately needed. But the gratitude never lasted long, because once she had healed them, Once they were whole again, they remembered that this child had seen their darkness, had witnessed their weaknesses, had looked into the parts of themselves they kept hidden, even from their own mates, and shame turned quickly to resentment, resentment to fear, and fear to hatred. By the time she was 16, no one in the pack would meet her eyes anymore. They would cross the street to avoid her, would whisper, "Ghost girl," and "moon wraith" when she passed, would warn their children to stay away from the cursed Omega who could see into souls. When she presented as an Omega at 16, there had been a brief, flickering moment when she thought perhaps her designation would save her. Because Omegas were valuable, were needed, were cherished, even if they were strange. But that hope had been crushed quickly enough when the first potential mate had taken one look at her, learned about her gift, and said with clear disgust that he would never bind himself to someone who could see every shameful thought he'd ever had, every dark desire, every hidden fear. Because what kind of life would that be? Living with someone who knew you too well to ever let you pretend you were better than you were. The rejections had followed, one after another, each one finding a different excuse, but all of them coming back to the same fundamental truth, that Seraphina Ashwood was too strange, too unsettling, too much a reminder that beneath the civilized veneer of pack life, everyone was hiding something they didn't want exposed. She had stopped hoping after the fourth rejection, had stopped even pretending to care after the fifth, and now she simply endured these ceremonies because she had no choice, because unmated Omegas were required to present themselves, because the pack would not let her fade into obscurity no matter how much she wished they would. The sun was rising higher now, burning off some of the frost, and Sarah could hear the approach of horses and carriages, the visiting dignitaries arriving to inspect the merchandise, and her stomach twisted with the familiar nausea of humiliation that came with being looked at like an object, evaluated like property, found wanting and discarded. The first group of visitors walked past, their eyes scanning the line of Omegas with varying degrees of interest. And Sarah watched from beneath her lashes as her pack sisters were chosen one by one, saw the way their faces lit up with relief and joy as alphas and betas claimed them, led them away to new lives in new packs, where perhaps they would find happiness. She felt nothing but a dull ache that might have been envy once, but was now just exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had stopped believing good things could happen to her. Pack Alpha Marcus was in his element, playing the gracious host, steering the more prestigious visitors toward his favorite Omegas, the beautiful ones, the accomplished ones, the ones who would bring honor to Crimson Vale when they made it into powerful families. And Sarah knew without looking that he was actively steering them away from her end of the line, the way he always did, the way he had explicitly instructed her to stay hidden, to not draw attention, to not embarrass him by letting these important visitors see what Crimson Vale kept in its undesirable house. 2 hours passed, then 3, and the line grew shorter as Omega after Omega was claimed, led away smiling until only 8 remained, the ones no one wanted, the damaged goods that Marcus had tried so hard to hide, and Sarah felt the familiar burning in her throat that meant tears were close. But she refused to let them fall, refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had survived 6 of these ceremonies, had survived 24 years of being unwanted, and she would survive this too, would go back to the undesirable house and lose herself in helping the traumatized pups who still needed her, who didn't care that she could see their nightmares because they were too young to understand shame, too innocent to hate her for the gift that let her soothe their terrors. The thought of those pups, of little Mira who had nightmares about the rogue attack that killed her parents, of tiny Jace who woke screaming from dreams of abandonment, of sweet Leanna who dreamed of the fire that scarred half her face. That thought was what kept Sarah standing upright when every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to escape this fresh humiliation. And then the commotion started, a ripple of shock and confusion moving through the assembled crowd like a wave. And Sarah looked up despite herself, despite knowing that nothing good ever came from hoping, and saw the reason for the disturbance. Guards in silver armor were entering the clearing, their movements precise and coordinated, carrying banners that bore the emblem of a silver wolf howling at a crescent moon, and behind them walked more guards, forming a protective corridor. And even from a distance, Sarah could feel the power radiating from whoever they were protecting, could sense the collective intake of breath from every wolf in the clearing as they recognized what those banners meant. The Alpha King had come to Crimson Vale, unannounced, unexpected, and utterly unprecedented, because Alpha Kings did not attend choosing ceremonies in small, insignificant packs on the edge of the northern realms, did not lower themselves to participate in what was essentially a marketplace for Omegas, did not concern themselves with the domestic arrangements of their subjects. Pack Alpha, Marcus looked like he might faint, his face cycling rapidly through shock, confusion, and barely concealed panic as he rushed forward to bow, to prostrate himself before the unexpected royal visitor. And Sarah watched the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were observing it from very far away, as if none of this could possibly have anything to do with her. The Alpha King emerged from between his guards, and even from the far end of the line, even with her eyes that she kept carefully downcast out of habit and self-preservation, Sarah could see him clearly, could see the long silver hair that he wore tied back from his face, hair that was the exact same shade as hers, like moonlight made solid, like starlight woven into strands. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, a stuttering skip that made no sense, that she refused to acknowledge, because she had learned long ago that her heart was not to be trusted, that it would betray her every single time if she let it. She watched as the Alpha King walked past the first group of Omegas, the beautiful ones who had primped and preened, who now stood frozen in various poses of submission and allure, and he did not even glance at them, did not slow his steady, purposeful stride. Marcus was talking rapidly, gesturing toward his daughter, who was a stunning blonde Omega with perfect features and an accomplished lineage, offering her with the desperation of a merchant trying to sell his finest wares. But the Alpha King walked past her too, past all of them, his eyes scanning the line with an intensity that made Sarah's skin prickle with awareness. He was moving toward the end of the line, toward the 8 unwanted Omegas who had been rejected by everyone else, and Sarah felt her pulse begin to race, with something that felt dangerously close to hope, but could not possibly be hope, because hope was what got you hurt, what got you destroyed, what left you bleeding on the ground, wondering why you had been stupid enough to believe, even for a moment, that you deserved anything good. The Alpha King stopped directly in front of their small group, his storm gray eyes moving over each face with careful consideration, and Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to look up, refusing to meet those eyes that she could feel on her like a physical touch, burning and assessing and seeing far too much. There was a heavy silence, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe, and then he moved, taking one step to the side, positioning himself directly in front of where Sarah stood partially hidden behind a taller Omega, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding and impossibly gentle all at once, a contradiction that made her traitorous heart skip again. "That one," he said, and the clearing erupted in shocked whispers, in gasps of disbelief, because surely he could not mean what they thought he meant. Surely the Alpha King was not pointing at the ghost girl, the moon wraith, the cursed Omega that even Crimson Veil wanted to hide. "Step forward," he said, and Sarah realized with a jolt of pure terror that he was talking to her, that his finger was pointing directly at her, that this was not some mistake or misunderstanding, but an impossible reality that made no sense at all, and her legs were moving before her brain could catch up, carrying her forward on instinct and years of conditioning to obey authority, bringing her to stand in front of him while every eye in the clearing stared at her with varying degrees of shock, pity, and confusion. She kept her eyes down, kept her breathing as steady as she could manage, despite the way her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. And then, his hand was there, warm fingers beneath her chin, tilting her face up with infinite gentleness, forcing her to meet his gaze. And when their eyes locked, when violet gray met storm gray, Seraphina Ashwood felt the entire world shift beneath her feet. Because she knew those eyes, knew that face, knew the exact pattern of silver in his hair, and the slight scar above his left eyebrow, and the way his jaw tightened when he was feeling something intense. And the knowledge hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her gasp out loud. "You," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it, before she could remember that Omegas did not speak to Alpha Kings without permission, that she should be silent and submissive and grateful for whatever attention he was giving her. "You're real. You're the man from my dreams." And even as the words left her mouth, she knew how insane they sounded, knew that everyone was staring at her like she had lost her mind. But she could not stop, could not unsee the truth that was blazing in front of her like the sun after years of darkness. The Alpha King smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines of authority and power into something warm and real and directed entirely at her. And when he spoke, his words were for her alone, even though the entire clearing could hear them. "And you," he said softly, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made her eyes burn with unshed tears, "are the woman from mine, the one I have been searching for 5 long years, the one my mother promised me I would find if I was patient enough, brave enough, faithful enough to believe in what I saw in the dreams we shared." The mate bond snapped into place between them with such force that Sarah actually staggered, would have fallen if his other hand had not shot out to steady her, to hold her upright while silver light exploded between them, visible to every wolf in the clearing, undeniable proof that the moon goddess herself had marked them as true mates, as two halves of one soul finally reunited after being separated by distance and time and circumstances that had tried to keep them apart. The light was blinding, beautiful, terrifying, and as it faded, leaving only the warm, constant pull of the bond thrumming between them like a second heartbeat, Seraphina Ashwood realized that her entire life had just changed in the span of a single moment, and she had absolutely no idea what happened next. The silver light that had erupted between them when the mate bond snapped into place was still fading from Seraphina's vision when Pac Alpha Marcus finally recovered enough from his shock to begin speaking, his voice taking on a tone that she had heard him use countless times before when he was trying to spin a situation to his advantage, trying to make himself look better than he was, trying to rewrite history in a way that would benefit him. "Your Majesty, what an honor, what an incredible blessing that you have chosen our Seraphina. We always knew she was special, of course, always recognized her unique gifts and qualities, even took her in as an infant when she was abandoned at our borders and raised her as one of our own, gave her every advantage. every opportunity to develop her extraordinary abilities. And the lies flowed from his mouth so smoothly, so convincingly, that if Sarah had not lived through the reality of her 24 years in this pack, she might have almost believed him herself. But the Alpha King, whose name she still did not know even though the mate bond was singing between them like a living thing, humming with warmth and rightness and a belonging she had never felt before, turned to look at Marcus with eyes that had gone cold and hard as winter ice. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made every wolf in the clearing instantly submit, dropping their gazes and bowing their heads in instinctive deference to a predator so far above them in the hierarchy that challenging him was not even a possibility their wolves would consider. "You called her cursed," the Alpha King said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of shock and discomfort that spread through the assembled crowd. And Sarah felt something crack open in her chest at the realization that he had heard, that he knew, that he was not going to let Marcus pretend away her suffering. "I heard you quite clearly when you were steering visiting alphas away from her, telling them that she was damaged goods, problematic, more trouble than she was worth, unnatural. And those were just the words you used this morning, which leads me to wonder what you have called her over the past 24 years when you thought no one of consequence was listening." Marcus had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, and Sarah found herself frozen in place, caught between the urge to run and hide from this confrontation and a fierce, burning satisfaction at seeing the man who had made her life miserable finally being called to account for his cruelty. The Alpha King had not released her, his hand still resting gently on her arm, anchoring her to him, and she could feel the warmth of his touch through the thin fabric of her worn gray dress, could feel the strength radiating from him, the protective fury that he was barely holding in check. "I think perhaps there has been a misunderstanding, Your Majesty," Marcus tried again, his voice taking on a wheedling quality that made Sarah's skin crawl with remembered humiliation. Seraphina has always been treated with the utmost care and respect, given a place in our pack when many would have turned away an orphaned infant, provided with food and shelter and education. We have only ever wanted what was best for her. "Then why?" the Alpha King asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "Does she look like she has not had a decent meal in weeks? Why is her dress patched and worn when I can see other Omegas wearing silk and fine wool? Why does she flinch when you speak as if she expects to be struck? Why does every wolf in this clearing seem surprised that anyone would choose her? And why, most importantly, did you position her at the very end of the line where she would be least visible, least likely to be noticed by anyone who might value what she has to offer?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Sarah watched Marcus struggle to find answers that would not condemn him, watched him realize that there were no good answers, that the truth of how Crimson Veil had treated her was written in every threadbare garment she wore, every hollow in her too thin frame, every instinctive cringe she could not quite suppress. The mate bond was growing stronger with every passing moment, and with it came something Sarah had not expected, a flowing of emotion and sensation from the Alpha King to her, letting her feel his rage on her behalf, his protective fury at what he was discovering, his absolute certainty that she deserved better than what she had been given. And the force of his conviction was almost overwhelming because she had spent so long believing that she deserved nothing, that she was lucky to have even the scraps Crimson Veil had thrown her way. "I think," the Alpha King said, turning his attention fully to Sarah and effectively dismissing Marcus as if he were no longer worth the energy it took to acknowledge his existence. That we should leave this place, you and I, and begin the journey to my kingdom, where you will be treated as you should have been treated all along, as my mate, as my Luna, as the most valuable person in my entire realm. Because that is what the mate bond makes you, irreplaceable and precious beyond measure. His words should have filled her with joy, with relief, with the overwhelming happiness of someone being rescued from a nightmare. But instead, Sarah felt panic rising in her throat, sharp and suffocating, because this was happening too fast, too suddenly, too impossibly to be real. And she had learned through painful experience that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. I do not understand, she heard herself saying, her voice coming out smaller and more fragile than she wanted it to. You are the Alpha King. You could have anyone, any Omega in the entire Northern Realms would be honored to be your mate. Women who are beautiful and accomplished and politically valuable, who come from great families with illustrious lineages, who have never been called cursed, or unnatural, or damaged. So why would you choose me? Why would you claim someone that even her own pack does not want? What could you possibly see in me that everyone else has looked past? The Alpha King studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze, to meet those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. And when he answered, his voice was soft, but absolutely certain, carrying the weight of unshakable conviction. Because, for 5 years, ever since the night my mother died and told me with her last breath that my mate would have silver hair like mine and the gift of seeing souls like she did, I have been walking through dreams searching for you. And in those dreams, I found a woman who spent her nights comforting traumatized children, who walked through nightmares that would have broken lesser souls and emerged with her compassion intact, who saw the absolute worst that people had to offer, all their darkness and shame and hidden cruelty, and still chose kindness, still chose to help, still chose to heal rather than to judge or condemn. He reached up with his free hand to brush a strand of her silver hair back from her face, the gesture so gentle it made her chest ache with an emotion she could not name. I fell in love with your soul before I ever knew your name, fell in love with the way you sang to frighten children in their dreams, the way you held space for grief without trying to fix it or make it go away, the way you saw people at their most vulnerable and treated that vulnerability as something sacred rather than something to exploit. And I have been searching for you in the waking world ever since, traveling to every pack in the Northern Realms, attending every gathering and ceremony, hoping that one day I would see that silver hair and know that I had finally found you. Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying, hot and fast and unstoppable, because no one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her like she was something precious, like she mattered, like her gift was a blessing rather than a curse. And the cognitive dissonance between what she had always believed about herself and what he was telling her was almost too much to process. But you do not know me, she whispered, even as part of her recognized the absurdity of the statement. Because if he had truly been dream-walking with her for 5 years, he probably knew her better than anyone else alive, had seen her in her most authentic moments when she thought no one was watching, when she let down all her guards and simply was. You do not know what it is like to live with someone who can see your every secret, your every shame. You do not know how that will feel when the initial excitement of the mate bond wears off and you realize that you can never hide anything from me, that I will see every dark thought and selfish impulse and moment of weakness, and you will come to resent me for it just like everyone else has. I am a dream walker too, he said, and the revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing what little breath she had left, because dream walking was rare, incredibly rare, and she had never met another person who shared her gift, had never even heard of another wolf who could do what she did. My mother was one, taught me to use the gift before she died, though I have kept it secret because it is seen as a female ability, and my counsel would use it as evidence that I am too soft, too empathetic, too connected to emotion to rule effectively. And his smile was wry, self-deprecating, but his eyes were serious as he continued. So I know exactly what it is like, Serafina. I know what it means to see into souls, to witness darkness and pain and all the things people hide, and I also know that sharing that gift, sharing that burden with someone who understands it, is a blessing beyond measure, because you and I will never have to pretend with each other. We'll never have to hide who we really are. We'll never have to fear that the other will see too much and run away. The truth of his words resonated through the mate bond, letting her feel his sincerity, his absolute belief in what he was saying. And Sarah wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be real, that she could have what every Omega dreamed of, a mate who valued her, a home where she belonged, a purpose beyond simple survival. But the scars of 24 years of rejection ran deep, carved into her sense of self like canyons carved by rivers, impossible to ignore or wish away, and she found herself asking the question that terrified her most. What if I am not strong enough for this? What if I cannot be what you need me to be? What if I fail you, or embarrass you, or prove that everyone who ever rejected me was right to do so? The fears spilled out in a rush, all the doubts and insecurities that she had carried for so long, all the voices in her head that whispered she was not good enough, would never be good enough, was fundamentally and irreparably broken. Then we will fail together, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if the idea of her failing alone was not even a possibility he would consider. And we will learn from it and try again, because that is what mates do, what partners do. We support each other through weakness as well as strength. We catch each other when we fall. We remind each other of our worth when we forget. And Serafina, I need you to understand something very important. He took both of her hands in his, and she noticed for the first time that his hands were shaking very slightly, that despite his outward confidence and authority, he was nervous too, was taking a risk on this just as much as she was. I am not asking you to be perfect. I am not asking you to be something you are not. I am asking you to be exactly who you already are. The woman I have watched help dozens of wolves heal from trauma they thought would destroy them. The woman who gives everything she has to help others, even when she has nothing left for herself. The woman whose compassion is so deep and so real that it shines through even in dreams, even in the darkest nightmares where most people would succumb to fear. He paused, searching her face as if trying to gauge whether his words were reaching her, whether she was truly hearing what he was trying to tell her. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped to something almost reverent. My mother told me before she died that the moon goddess gives us mates who complement us, who balance our weaknesses with their strengths and vice versa. And I believe she was right because I have spent 7 years ruling alone, making decisions that affect thousands of lives, carrying the weight of an entire kingdom on my shoulders. And I am good at it. I am strong and decisive and capable. But I am also lonely, Serafina. So desperately lonely because I cannot let anyone see my doubts, or my fears, or my moments of weakness, because a king must always appear infallible. must always project strength, even when he feels like he is drowning. His thumbs stroked across her knuckles, a soothing rhythm that she found herself synchronizing her breathing to. But you see souls. You understand that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but rather two sides of the same coin. You could be the one person in my life who I never have to pretend with, who I can be completely honest with about my struggles and my doubts, and that possibility, that chance to finally be seen and accepted for all of who I am. Not just the powerful parts, but the broken parts too. That is worth more to me than any political alliance or strategic advantage. Sarah felt something shifting inside her, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. Because she had spent her entire life believing that her gift made her a burden, that seeing people's darkness and pain was something that drove them away, but he was telling her that it was exactly what he needed, that her ability to witness vulnerability without judgment was not a curse, but rather the most valuable thing she could offer. "I am afraid," she admitted, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her, from the part of her that had been hurt so many times it no longer believed safety was possible. "I am so afraid of hoping, of believing this is real, of letting myself want this only to have it ripped away when you realize I am not what you thought I was, when the reality of living with me every day becomes too much, when you see some darkness in me that makes you change your mind about wanting me as your mate." "I have already seen your darkness," he said gently, and there was no judgment in his voice, only acceptance, and something that might have been love, though Sarah hardly dared to name it as such. "I have walked through your dreams for 5 years, remember? I have seen your nightmares about being abandoned, about being rejected again and again, about dying alone and unmourned. I have witnessed your moments of despair when you questioned whether you had any value at all, your moments of anger when you raged at the unfairness of a world that punished you for things beyond your control, your moments of such profound loneliness that it made my own heart ache in sympathy. And knowing all of that, seeing all of that, I am still here, still claiming you, still absolutely certain that you are exactly who I have been waiting for." He released one of her hands to reach up and cup her face, wiping away her tears with his thumb. "So please, Seraphina Ashwood, please come with me. Please let me show you what it feels like to be valued and protected and cherished. Please give us both a chance to see what we could become together. And if at any point you decide this is not what you want, if you choose to leave, I will let you go. I will make sure you are safe and provided for, but I will not force you to stay, because the only mate bond worth having is one that is chosen freely by both parties." The clearing had gone silent around them, every wolf watching this exchange with varying degrees of shock and fascination, and Sarah realized dimly that she should probably be embarrassed by having such an intimate conversation in front of an audience. But somehow, she could not bring herself to care, could not focus on anything except the man in front of her and the impossible choice he was offering her. She could stay here in Crimson Vale, could return to the undesirable house and her small, safe, miserable life where she knew exactly what to expect, where there were no risks because there were also no possibilities, or she could take his hand and step into the terrifying unknown, could choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than scraps and shadows. The mate bond was pulling at her, urging her toward him, and she realized with a start that it was not just the bond influencing her decision. It was her own heart, her own desperate hunger for connection and belonging, her own fierce, stubborn hope that refused to die completely, no matter how many times it had been beaten down. "I will come with you," she said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff, like free-falling through space with no idea if there would be anything to catch her. But they also felt like the first truly honest thing she had said in years. The first choice she had made purely because she wanted to, not because she was obligated or expected or forced. I will come with you, and I will try. I will try to believe that this is real, that you truly want me, that I am not going to wake up and discover this was all some cruel dream, and I am still terrified. I am still convinced that this is going to end badly, but I am also tired. So tired of being afraid, of letting fear make my decisions for me, of surviving instead of living. So yes, I will come with you and see what happens. The smile that spread across his face was radiant, transforming him from intimidating alpha king to simply a man who had just been given something precious, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest, while the mate bond flared between them with such intensity that she gasped, overwhelmed by the rush of emotion and sensation, by the feeling of being wanted, of mattering to someone, of finally belonging. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, and she could feel the sincerity of it through the bond, could feel how much her agreement meant to him. Thank you for being brave enough to take this chance, for trusting me even when every experience you have had tells you not to. I promise you, Serafina, I will spend every day proving that your trust is not misplaced. He released her slowly, as if reluctant to let her go even for a moment, and turned to address his guards who had been standing in respectful silence throughout the entire exchange. Prepare a carriage for my mate. She will ride with me, and we leave for Silver Peak Kingdom immediately. I see no reason to linger here any longer than necessary. And the guards snapped to attention, moving with efficient precision to carry out his orders. Sarah watched them go, her mind still struggling to process the fact that she was leaving, that she was truly doing this, when a thought occurred to her that made her chest tighten with sudden panic. The children, she said, turning to look up at him with wide eyes. There are children in the Undesirable house, traumatized pups that I have been helping with their nightmares. They need me. I cannot just abandon them without warning, without saying goodbye, without making sure someone else will continue to help them. Something soft and warm flowed through the mate bond, and when she met his eyes, she saw understanding there, saw that her concern for the children only confirmed what he already believed about her character. We will not leave them behind, he said firmly, his voice taking on the tone of absolute authority that she was beginning to recognize meant he was making a royal decree, something that would not be questioned or countermanded. Any child in that undesirable house who wishes to come with us will be welcomed in Silver Peak Kingdom. They will be given proper housing, proper care, proper education and training. They will be valued for who they are rather than cast aside for being different, and you, my brilliant mate, can continue to help them heal while also training other dreamwalkers in your techniques, because I suspect your gift is not nearly as rare as you have been led to believe. I suspect there are many wolves who have the potential, but no one to teach them how to use it safely. The casual way he said it, as if uprooting an entire house full of unwanted children and bringing them to the royal kingdom, was the most natural thing in the world, as if her work was valuable enough to build an entire program around, made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion, and she found herself falling a little bit more in love with this man who saw possibility where others saw only problems. Thank you, she managed to say, though the words felt entirely inadequate for the magnitude of what he was offering. Thank you for understanding, for not asking me to choose between you and them. You should never have to make that choice, he said simply, as if it were obvious, as if any other response would have been unthinkable. And then he was taking her hand and leading her toward where his guards were preparing the carriage. And Sarah allowed herself to be guided, her mind still spinning with the impossibility of everything that had happened in the last hour. She was leaving Crimson Vale, was leaving behind 24 years of rejection and pain and loneliness, was stepping into a future with a mate who claimed to have been searching for her through dreams for 5 years, who valued her gift instead of fearing it, who wanted to help the children she cared about, and it all felt like some beautiful, impossible fantasy that could not possibly be real. As they reached the carriage, as he helped her inside with a gentleness that suggested she was something fragile and precious, Sarah caught sight of Marcus watching from across the clearing, his face twisted with an expression she could not quite read, something between anger and calculation and fear. And a shiver of premonition ran down her spine, a warning whispered by the same instincts that had kept her alive in hostile territory for 24 years. She was about to dismiss it as paranoia, as the natural nervousness of someone whose entire life was changing, when she saw him turn and speak urgently to someone in the crowd, saw the way that person nodded and disappeared quickly into the pack house. And suddenly, the warning crystallized into certainty, sharp and clear and absolutely terrifying, because she knew with the unshakable conviction of her gift, that Marcus was not going to let her leave without consequences, that he was planning something, and whatever it was would threaten not just her, but the mate bond that had barely had time to form. The future that she had only just begun to believe might be possible. The premonition that had seized Serafina in those final moments before boarding the carriage proved prophetic in ways she could not have imagined, because barely 3 hours into their journey toward Silver Peak Kingdom, as the autumn sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon and painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the carriage suddenly lurched to a violent halt that threw Sarah against the Alpha King's chest, his arms coming up instinctively to steady her, even as his entire body went tense with the awareness of a predator sensing danger. The sounds outside were unmistakable to anyone who had lived among wolves, the snarls and growls of combat, the clash of weapons, the shouted orders of guards trying to maintain formation against an assault. And Sarah felt her heart drop into her stomach as she realized that her instincts had been correct, that Marcus had indeed sent someone after them, had orchestrated an attack that was designed to either kill the Alpha King or force him to reject her, to prove that she was more trouble than she was worth, that choosing her had been a mistake that would cost him everything. The Alpha King, whose name she had finally learned was Zephyr Silvermane during their journey, moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had survived countless attempts on his life, positioning himself between Sarah and the door of the carriage, his body becoming a shield, even as his hand went to the sword at his hip. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha who expected to be obeyed without question. "Stay in the carriage where my guards can protect you. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do not put yourself at risk, because if something happens to you now, if I lose you before we have even had a chance to begin, I will raze Crimson Vale to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." The violence in his voice, the barely controlled fury that spoke of exactly how much she already meant to him despite having known her for less than a day, should have terrified her. But instead, it made something warm and fierce unfurl in her chest, a sense of being valued, of being worth protecting, of mattering enough to someone that the thought of losing her could inspire such devastating rage. But Sarah had not survived 24 years in a hostile pack by being passive or helpless, had not developed her gifts by hiding from danger, and as Zephyr moved to exit the carriage and join his guards in defending against the attack, she found herself reaching out to grab his arm, her fingers closing around the silver fabric of his sleeve with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so delicate in appearance. "Wait," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "I can help. I have a gift that you have not seen yet, something beyond just dreamwalking, and if you will trust me, if you will let me use it, I can end this fight before anyone else has to die." She saw the refusal forming on his lips, saw the protective instinct warring with curiosity in his storm-gray eyes, and she pushed forward before he could deny her. "Please, Zephyr, please let me do this. Let me prove that I am not just someone who needs to be protected, that I can stand beside you as a partner, as an equal, that the moon goddess gave me these gifts for a reason, and this is it. This is what I was meant to do." The plea in her voice, the desperate need to prove her worth not just to him but to herself, must have reached him through the mate bond, because she felt his resistance crumbling, felt him warring between his instinct to keep her safe and his growing understanding that she was right, that she needed this, that their partnership could not be built on him constantly shielding her from the realities of his dangerous life. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally, and the trust implicit in that question, the willingness to defer to her expertise even when every instinct was screaming at him to lock her away where nothing could touch her, made Sarah love him a little bit more, made her even more determined to prove that his faith was not misplaced. "I need you to get me close enough to see the attackers clearly," she said, her mind already reaching out with the peculiar awareness that came with her gift, the ability to sense the sleeping or dreaming minds around her. Except this time she was looking for something different, for the waking consciousness that carried traces of nightmare and trauma, for the vulnerable places in the psyche where fear lived and could be exploited. "And I need you to trust that what I am about to do, while it may look like I am hurting them, is actually a mercy, is giving them the chance to confront their deepest fears and either overcome them or be consumed by them. And either outcome is better than death." Zephyr studied her face for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to read her intention, her certainty, her absolute conviction that she could do this, and then he nodded once, sharp and decisive, before pushing open the carriage door and pulling her out with him into the chaos of battle. The scene that greeted them was worse than Sarah had imagined, at least 20 wolves in their animal forms attacking the 12 royal guards who had accompanied them from Crimson Vale, and she recognized the attackers immediately as members of Marcus's elite force, warriors who were trained and brutal and willing to die for their alpha's commands, which meant Marcus had sent them knowing they would not return, had sacrificed his own people in a desperate gambit to either kill Zephyr or force him to abandon his newly claimed mate. The realization filled Sarah with a cold fury that was foreign to her gentle nature, because these wolves were being used, were being thrown away like garbage by an alpha who cared nothing for their lives, and she found herself reaching out with her gift in a way she had never attempted before, not to soothe or heal, but to terrify, to weaponize the very nightmares that she normally helped people escape. Her awareness expanded like ripples on water, touching each attacking wolf's consciousness with the lightest brush of her power. And what she found there was exactly what she expected: fear and doubt buried beneath layers of aggression and false bravado, nightmares about failure and inadequacy and death that every warrior carried but tried desperately to suppress. She gathered those fears like threads in her hands, pulling them to the surface of their waking minds, amplifying them until the wolves began to falter in their attacks, their snarls turning to whimpers as they suddenly found themselves confronting every terror they had ever tried to outrun, every horrible possibility their imaginations had ever conjured. Every way they could fail and suffer and die, made manifest in their minds with such vivid clarity that it became impossible to distinguish from reality. One by one, they broke, their wolf forms shaking and cowering, some shifting back to human in their panic and curling into fetal positions on the ground, others simply fleeing back toward Crimson Vale with their tails between their legs, and within minutes the attack that should have been a prolonged and bloody battle was over, ended without a single death, without Zephyr or his guards having to kill wolves who were only following orders they had been given by a corrupt alpha. The silence that followed was profound and heavy, broken only by the sounds of the defeated attackers whimpering or fleeing, and Sarah felt the power drain from her like water from a broken vessel, leaving her swaying on her feet and desperately grateful for Zephyr's arm that came around her waist to support her weight. "What did you do to them?" one of the guards asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and horror. And Sarah forced herself to answer, even though exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. "I showed them their nightmares made real, made them experience their deepest fears as if they were actually happening, and some of them will recover from it and be stronger for having confronted what terrified them, and some of them will be broken by it and will never be the same. But none of them had to die. And that is what matters, that we ended this without becoming the monsters that Marcus clearly hoped we would be." She felt Zephyr's arms tighten around her, felt his pride and amazement and slight concern flowing through the mate bond, and she leaned into his strength, letting him support her as the adrenaline began to fade and left her trembling with reaction. "You are extraordinary," Zephyr said softly, his lips against her hair, and the reverence in his voice made her chest ache with emotions she could not name. "And terrifying, and absolutely magnificent. And I understand now why my mother told me that my mate would be my greatest weapon and my strongest shield. Because you just ended a battle that could have killed half my guards without even drawing a weapon, without even raising your hand in violence. You simply used the gift the moon goddess gave you to protect what is yours, and I have never seen anything more beautiful or more powerful in my entire life." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, soothing the part of her that had been afraid he would be horrified by what she had done, by the proof that her gift could be used to harm as well as heal. And she found herself relaxing into his embrace, trusting him to keep her upright while her body recovered from the massive expenditure of energy. They continued their journey as soon as Sarah had recovered enough strength to sit upright without swaying, and as the carriage rolled through increasingly mountainous terrain, Zephyr told her more about Silver Peak Kingdom and what awaited her there, his voice painting pictures of soaring peaks and crystalline waterfalls, of a palace carved from silver stone that caught the moonlight and seemed to glow from within, of a people who valued wisdom and compassion as highly as strength and courage. And with every word, Sarah felt her anxiety diminishing, felt the possibility of belonging somewhere, of having a home, becoming more real and tangible. He also told her about his council, about the challenges she would face as an unknown Omega, suddenly elevated to the position of Luna Queen, about the political maneuvering and subtle tests that would come from those who questioned her worthiness, and instead of trying to shield her from these difficulties, he treated her as a partner, asking for her thoughts and opinions, taking her concerns seriously, making it clear that he expected her to rule beside him as an equal, rather than simply stand prettily at his side and defer to his judgment. The journey took 3 days. 3 days of growing closer and learning each other's patterns and preferences. 3 days of Zephyr courting her with a gentle patience that made her feel cherished rather than rushed. 3 days of long conversations that ranged from profound discussions about leadership and responsibility to silly debates about favorite foods and childhood memories. And by the time Silver Peak Kingdom came into view, rising from the mountains like something out of a fairy tale, Sarah realized with a start that she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with this man who had claimed her from a line of unwanted Omegas, who had defended her against her former pack's cruelty, who had trusted her enough to let her fight beside him, who had spent 3 days showing her in 1,000 small ways that she was valued and wanted and necessary to his happiness. The mate bond had settled between them like a living thing, warm and constant and growing stronger with each passing hour. And that night, when they finally reached the palace and were shown to their chambers, when Zephyr took her hands and asked with infinite gentleness if she was ready to complete the bond, to let him mark her and claim her fully as his mate and Luna, Sarah found herself saying yes without hesitation, without fear, without any of the doubts that had plagued her in Crimson Vale. The marking was gentle and fierce all at once, a claiming that left her gasping and trembling in his arms as the mate bond exploded between them in a rush of silver light that she could see even with her eyes closed, a connection so deep and profound that she felt his soul touching hers, felt every emotion and thought and sensation flowing between them without barrier or filter. And in that moment of perfect unity, she understood what the moon goddess had intended when she created mate bonds, understood that this was not about ownership or obligation, but about two souls recognizing each other and choosing, freely and completely, to become something greater together than they could ever be apart. When the light finally faded and they lay tangled together in silk sheets that smelled of him, of them, of home, Zephyr pressed a kiss to the mark he had left on her neck and whispered that he loved her, that he had loved her since the first dream they shared 5 years ago, and Sarah found herself crying again. But this time, the tears were joy and relief and overwhelming gratitude that she had been brave enough to take his hand and step into the unknown. The coronation ceremony was held under the full moon, exactly 2 weeks later, after Sarah had been given time to adjust to her new life, to meet the members of court and learn the protocols and expectations of her position. And as she stood before the assembled wolves of Silver Peak Kingdom, wearing a crown of silver and moonstone that had belonged to Zephyr's mother, listening to him declare her his Luna Queen before thousands of witnesses, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about the girl who had stood at the end of a line of unwanted Omegas, convinced she would die alone and unmourned, about the impossible choice she had made to trust a stranger who claimed to have been searching for her through dreams, about the battles she had fought, both external and internal, to reach this place of belonging and purpose and love. The crowd howled their approval when Zephyr marked her again in the traditional public ceremony, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed off the mountains and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And Sarah howled with them, her voice joining theirs in a song of celebration and acceptance. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel like an outsider looking in, but rather like someone who had finally found her pack, her people, her home. 5 years passed in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. 5 years of learning to rule beside Zephyr with wisdom and compassion, of using her gifts to help traumatized wolves heal from wounds both physical and psychological, of training other dreamwalkers in techniques she had developed through years of practice, of watching the children from Crimson Vale's undesirable house blossom into confident young wolves who knew their worth. And through it all, the mate bond between her and Zephyr only grew stronger, deeper, more essential to who they both were. On the 5th anniversary of her coronation, as Sarah sat in the palace gardens teaching a class of young dreamwalkers how to navigate nightmares without being consumed by them, she looked up to see Zephyr approaching with their 3-year-old daughter balanced on his shoulders. The child's silver hair so like both of theirs catching the afternoon sunlight and seeming to glow. And she felt such profound contentment wash through her that it was almost painful in its intensity, because this life, this family, this purpose was everything she had ever dreamed of, and so much more than she had ever dared to hope she deserved. A messenger arrived that afternoon with word that another Omega had been found in a distant pack. An Omega with unusual gifts who was being called cursed and unnatural, who was scheduled to be cast out for being too different. And Sarah did not hesitate before telling the messenger to bring the Omega to Silver Peak, to offer sanctuary and training, and the promise that here, in this place, being different was not a curse, but a blessing waiting to be unwrapped. As she watched the messenger depart on his mission of rescue, Sarah thought about the girl she had been, standing at the end of a line convinced she was unwanted, and she wished she could go back and tell that frightened, lonely girl that her story was not ending, but beginning, that the rejection and pain were not the final chapters, but merely the prologue to something beautiful and profound, and absolutely worth every moment of suffering it had taken to reach it. She felt Zephyr's hand slip into hers, felt their daughter's delighted laughter as she pointed at butterflies dancing among the flowers, and she squeezed his fingers gently, sending love and gratitude and absolute certainty through the mate bond that connected them, because she had stood among the undesirables and he had pointed at her and said, "That one." And in doing so, he had given her not just a crown or a title or a position of power, but something infinitely more valuable. He had given her belonging, had given her purpose, had given her the chance to be exactly who she was meant to be, and she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that every wolf who felt unwanted and broken and cursed would know that somewhere in this world there was a Luna Queen with silver hair who understood their pain and would move mountains to help them find their way home. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of silver and violet that matched her eyes, and as Sarah stood to gather her students and bring them inside for the evening meal, she thought about all the Omegas still waiting in lines, still believing they were unwanted, still convinced their differences made them worthless, and she made a silent promise to the moon goddess that she would find them, would save them, would show them that being chosen was not about being perfect, but about being brave enough to let yourself be seen, completely and authentically, by someone who had the wisdom to recognize the extraordinary hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary. She had been that Omega once, standing at the end of the line with her eyes downcast and her hope extinguished. And now she was a queen with the power to change lives, to rewrite stories, to prove that rejection was not an ending, but merely the moon goddess's way of redirecting you towards something better, something greater, something that was worth every tear you cried and every wound you carried to reach it. And that knowledge, that absolute certainty that her suffering had purpose and meaning, was perhaps the greatest gift of all. If you enjoyed Seraphina and Zephyr's story of finding love in the most unexpected places, of being chosen when you felt unwanted, of discovering that your greatest curse might actually be your greatest blessing? Please leave a comment below telling me what resonated with you most. Was it Sarah's journey from rejection to acceptance? Zephyr's patient devotion as he searched for his mate through dreams? Or perhaps the message that being different is not something to hide, but something to celebrate? I would love to hear your thoughts on this tale of silver-haired destined mates and the power of choosing to be brave, even when fear whispers that you are not enough. Please subscribe to this channel so you never miss future stories about alpha kings and powerful omegas, about fated mates who find each other against impossible odds, about the magic that happens when two souls recognize each other across distance and time and circumstance, because there are so many more tales waiting to be told, so many more wolves waiting to find their way home, and I cannot wait to share their journeys with you.